Thank you everyone for joining today's webinar, and at this time I'd like to turn it over to Bill.
Thanks, Michelle. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our monthly risk advisory webinar series. My name is Bill Heaven. I'm a senior director here at HBK. And again, I'd like to thank you for joining. This morning, we're going to talk about what I believe is going to be an interesting topic, and that is data privacy. Oops. Went too fast there. So here's our agenda. 5 topics and then a wrap up. I'll go through a few housekeeping items right now. So our presentation this morning is eligible for 1 hour of CPE credit. In order to obtain that credit, you're going to have to stay on for the entire presentation. And there's 4 content sensitive polling questions that will be popped up randomly during the presentation. And you'll have to answer those to receive the CPE credit. If you have any problems, we are monitoring the chat. So if something acts up with your browser, usually you can address it just by refreshing it. But if that doesn't work, use the chat, and we're monitoring that, and let us know that either you can't hear us or whatever you're experiencing, and we'll do our best to address that. And then we do plan on leaving a few minutes at the end of today's presentation for a question and answer. But if you have something comes up during this presentation, submit it into the Q&A box, and we'll tee those up for the end, and we'll address those. Also, we are going to be providing PDF copies of today's slide deck, as well as a recording of today's webinar after the webinar is concluded. So that will probably come out Thursday or Friday of this week. Let's move on to our next slide here, which is our learning objectives. This is just, we've started putting these in our webinars since we've moved to a new CPE administrator, so that this is, in essence, the takeaways from today's webinar, what our participants should be able to learn from attending today's webinar. Again, my name is Bill Heaven. I have a dual role here at HBK. So I'm responsible for internal IT security within the firm, as well as doing some client-facing work. But predominantly, I'm just doing internal IT security for HBK. So let's move on and get going on today's topic with our first agenda item of definitions and differences. So the topic of IT security and then data privacy, or just privacy, often they get intermingled and people get confused and mixed up. This on the screen here is a good definition of IT security. What I usually refer to IT security is covered predominantly in this definition from the National Institute of Standards and Technology, otherwise known as NIST. A lot of times, cybersecurity, you just hear of the cybersecurity triad, which is the CIA triad, or confidentiality, integrity, and availability, which is covered in this definition from NIST, but it does not talk a lot about availability, would be the only difference. But the good definition of IT security. Conversely, definition of data privacy, which, by the way, in this presentation, if I refer to it as data privacy or just privacy, I'm using the same term. They're synonymous with each other. But ideally, privacy is just basically the right to be left alone or control how your data is used. Like I said, they are not the same. They are broadly connected, but they are different. Again, privacy is going to focus more on the governance and use of the data, where IT security is going to try to keep us from being the victim of a cyber hack or a malicious hack, and then they steal our data and use it for to make money. So keep in mind that you need IT security to protect your data, but you don't necessarily need IT security to address privacy. But they are often intertwined and confused. So why do we even care about privacy? And if I'll talk about a few things here that maybe some of you haven't thought of, or maybe you have. But so our information is being captured and mined all the time. And just here's a few examples of how privacy and the data that they collect about us could be used. It's somewhat unnerving. When I first started here at HBK, I'm a creature of habit, so I often would go to Subway for lunch. And I noticed one time that my phone started telling me, hey, it's almost time for you to go to Subway. Or maybe you've woke up in the morning and you take a look at your phone and it starts telling you that, because it's a weekday, and it's telling you that you might want to take a different route to work because there's a traffic accident. Now, some people think those are just really great things. I tend to look down on those and not like it. So in my case, I don't have location services turned on my phone any longer because I don't want those recommendations from Surrey on, it's time to go to lunch or whatever. Also, if you think about it, the IoT or Internet of Things are getting more and more prevalent in today's world. But you could think of it this way. If you have one of these programmable thermostats in your house, which I actually do, but it's a good thing for saving money, but also keep in mind that it will reveal tendencies about you. Somebody that has that information could determine what your work schedule is, when you go to bed, perhaps if you're out of town or on vacation. Another Internet of Things example would be these Roombas, where we set up our remote control, so to speak, vacuum cleaner to clean our floors at night. But what's it doing and providing an exact floor plan of our home and what furniture we have, and there could be some negative aspects of things of that nature. So keep those in mind. For those wanting CPE, here's our first question of the day. So I talked about two organizations that were on the definitions of IT security and data privacy. So here's poll question number 1. Michelle, let me know when people are predominantly answered with the question, and we can move on to the next topic. Okay, it looks like there's almost everyone is done with that. So I'm going to go ahead and keep going here, and we'll pick that up. So let's talk about some of the our next agenda item and talk about prominent trends in IT security, or our data privacy, I should say. See, I'm mixing up the terms myself. But our trends that are coming today is these 5 on the screen here. And then I have a couple other slides to talk about, but these are starting to show up more and more. But data localization, which another way to look at that is, where is your data? You need to know where your data is, especially with all the cloud opportunities that we have now. Enhancing computations regarding privacy data, which is another way to say artificial intelligence. And this is getting to be a really big deal. And later on in the presentation, I'm going to talk to you about a source for information on data privacy. but AI or intelligence is getting to be a big deal with privacy. People are wanting to know how those algorithms are written and what they're doing with those algorithms, and it's getting to be more and more prevalent. So I would expect for us to start hearing more and more about that. Remote monitoring is a up and coming trend, trying to balance security and privacy. And the thing that's really noteworthy in this trend is that with COVID mostly behind us now, but there's some lasting impacts of it with remote work. So now statistically, we do have a lot more remote workers, and these remote workers, some of the studies I've read about, are 49% of those remote workers are using their own computer hardware. So then that brings in some more privacy and security issues that we have to be concerned about. So now we have to worry about our employees. How do we back up their data? And how do we back up only our company data, not their personal data that is on their personal device? And how do we delete data when they're no longer employed by us? Because we can only delete the company data, not the personal data, or else there's going to be, so I'll just call it hard feelings. And then moving on, the next trend would be that customers have more ways to manage their data. It seems like you can't visit a website today without it talking to you about a privacy policy or what they're using cookies for. And cookies is just, it's a name of a file that a lot of websites use to track, to quote unquote, make your user experience more beneficial or more flow better through their website. But make no mistake, they are tracking information about you, and they could sell that information. So there are more and more things that are being done by companies out there to make their use of privacy type data more transparent and to let you know what's going on, but you have more choices there. And then the last trend that is interesting to learn about is that data is no longer considered the new oil. And what that means is back in the Industrial Revolution era and then the oil booms, where oil created many billionaires, millionaires, and it was thought that the people that controlled the data were going to have a similar experience. But now, based on the fact of privacy regulations becoming more and more prevalent, data is no longer thought of as the new oil, because it's thought of as being a big or a larger risk. So it's the more data you have, the more risk you're suspect to. Moving on to other trends, just speak about the United States, because privacy really got its start with what's a piece of regulation out of Europe called GDPR, the General Data Protection Requirement. But I'll just talk about some trends here in the United States. So we have a lot of different states enacting their own privacy laws, and it's really thought, just like you can use an analogous to sales tax, but that we should have some type of federal legislation that's going to control privacy. With the political environment that we currently have in Washington, D.C., it's not expected that we're going to get any type of federal privacy law anytime soon, which leads to our second U.S. trend, which that privacy regulation or laws at the state level is expected to continue to increase. Global requirements is basically, I talked about GDPR. This is like the grandfather of privacy regulation. Enforcement of GDPR is actually upticking and trending upwards. probably a lot because of the not having to deal with COVID as much. But just recently, Amazon was fined $746 million for violating GDPR. Some other, not necessarily GDPR fines, but just privacy fines in general. Meta, parent of Facebook, was fined $275 million for privacy violations. A company called Clearview AI, or artificial intelligence, was fined $20 million. Twitter was fined $400 million. WhatsApp is a privacy type encryption tool that is used by some, was fined for $267 million. And there was a dating app called Grindr that was fined $6.5 million. So fines are definitely moving up, and GDPR is a big, enforcement is a big piece of that. And then there's other legislation that's expected in Europe, where I've put those 5 acts, of which one note is artificial intelligence, because those legislative efforts are definitely on the increase. So the reason why it's important to think of Europe is just for the fact that Europe is where this whole thing got started with GDPR. So we can expect that these acts that are going through legislation in Europe are more than likely going to, in some form, shape, or form, are going to make their way over to the U.S. Here's our second polling question. So if you want to receive CPE or continuing professional education, go ahead and answer this question. Hopefully it's not too difficult, but give a couple more minutes here to answer. All right, and then I'll move on to our next. It looks like about the same number of people that answered the first one. So I know not everybody wants to get CPE, but so I'll move on here. And let's move on to our next agenda item, which is, I've spent a lot of time talking about privacy regulations. So how do you know what's going on? So there's a good source of information out there, and it's an organization called the International Association of Privacy Professionals. It's also, their acronym is IAPP, and the website is iapp.org. So this is where I go to keep tabs on what's going on privacy regulation wise. So you can get tons of information there. Actually, I'm going to have a couple slides coming up to talk about regulation tracking in the U.S. And you can drill down and learn specifically about the new privacy regulation in California that's replaced the CCPA, which was mirrored after GDPR. So keep this website in mind if you're interested in tracking anything privacy related. So here's a tracker from the IAPP, and you can see in the bottom corner where it's, I'm not sure if you can see my cursor or not, but this was as of about 2 weeks ago. So pretty current regulation tracking. And you can see by the color code where laws have been put in place, which is the green, which you've got basically California, Utah, Colorado, Virginia, and then actually it's Connecticut right here in the green. And laws where something's been introduced, or whether it's in committee, or whether it's gone inactive, or just no comprehensive bills. So this is as I said, I track this on a fairly regular basis. And last year, Ohio was in 2022 had had legislation in process, but it evidently got shot down because we're now listed as a no bills being introduced. So it's tracking that it's not as big of a deal here in Ohio. But this is there's a lot of some years. Last year there seemed to be more legislation, but as I said earlier, with the trends, it's looking like it's going to. Don't be surprised if it ramps up again, because we're not going to get any federal oversight from a privacy perspective. Here's a different way that you can look at and these are just links within the IAPP website, that it'll give you specific details, rights to access, what rights to correct. You can see it on the chart going across the top, and then the green is analogous to the state of what it is, and that it lines up the same way that map did, but it just gives you much more details about what the privacy law is actually, what has been included in it, and what you may or may not have to be aware of. And keep in mind that I know that most of the people on this webinar are probably from the local area in Ohio or Pennsylvania. We get some people from the surrounding states as well, but it's where the customer is located. So here at HBK, I said I do a lot of internal security work. We actually have some customers that reside in California, so I or the firm needs to be aware of what's going on with the California privacy law. And there's different parts of the regulation that say if somebody contacts us and asks us what personal information we have on them, we have to follow the requirements in that regulation. So don't think that just because you're not living in, or your business isn't located in one of the states that we've talked about here that already have privacy regulation. It's where the customer resides as to where you have to be, take that into account as to where you may or may not have to adhere to a particular state. Let's talk about some recent changes in privacy regulations. So again, I talked a lot about GDPR and how that was where everything originated from. So the CCPA, or the California Consumer Privacy Act, really mimicked a lot of GDPR, and it went into effect in January of 2020. Now it's already had some amendments to it, and it's called the CPRA, or the California Privacy Rights Act, which just went into effect this past January. But the businesses that must comply are the same for both laws. And again, you only have to meet one of these requirements. So again, I mentioned that HBK has to be concerned about CCPA or CPRA because we have a few customers or clients in California. And so all we have to do is we hit one of these thresholds, not all three, just one of them. So if your sales are above 25 million, then you have to worry about it. If you receive or disclose personal information of more than 50,000 California residents, you have to be aware of it. Or if you make 50% or more of your annual revenues from selling information, then you have to pay attention to the California laws. So again, keep that in mind. If you would happen to have customers in Europe, then you would be have to follow GDPR. So that IAPP.org website, it could be a good resource for you to keep in mind and track what's going. Or you may, if it's a big enough risk for you, you might want to look into a privacy. They have lawyers that specify and specialize in privacy. So you may need to do that, but I think more than likely you'll be able to cover yourself just by keeping tabs on the iapp.org. But that's a personal decision for each of your businesses. Let's move on to a next topic, which is creating privacy controls. So part of what I talked about in the learning objectives is that, I will give you background on how to rank your own maturity of your privacy program. So I'll start out, I'll do that, but I'll give you a little bit of a hack to try to shortcut coming up with privacy controls. And you can do that simply by looking at some of the privacy frameworks, which we have frameworks for everything. In the IT security world, there's the frameworks that are a lot of the same organizations. You can have ISACA has frameworks for security. NIST does. So again, there's privacy frameworks out there, and these are just a few. NIST also has a privacy framework, but I did not include it on this list. But there's lots of frameworks that you can decide to pick from, and that they have what are called principles. So GDPR, which has been a star of my webinar today, these are the I think it's 7 or 8 principles that they adhere to come up with their controls. Now I could have picked ISACA's principles, which they have, it's 14 privacy principles. Now you can find crosswalk for the frameworks where it'll tie all the different frameworks out there together, so you know what they're looking at. So there's a crosswalk out there which actually ties GDPR to ISACA and says which one of these 14 principles ties to the 7 principles, and make sure it covers everything. So most of the frameworks do cover all of the principles of the main frameworks, but you'll get a couple of them that will say like it's not applicable, or so that might not be a good framework for you to choose. But I'll work through an example here where I'll take a principle and show you how that can be converted into a control, and then I'll talk about how that control can be evaluated as to how it equates to the maturity of your privacy program. So let's before we go into that example, let's do this is our third of 4 CPE questions for those of you wanting CPE. So go ahead and answer that one for me. All right, couple, almost there. A little bit more time here. All right, that looks like about the same number of people that have been answering the previous ones. So right here, talk about, so if you're going to have a privacy program, these are the key requirements that you're going to want to make sure are present. The last one we're going to talk more in detail about, which is the maturity of that program. But you want to make sure that people know about your privacy program and how you're handling data, and so you want to make people aware of that and communicate that, and then have some way to track through metrics. Are you actually following your own program, or is it being used? So then what are privacy controls? Similar to, I talked about the frameworks where you've got NIST is big with their 800-37 publication that talks about privacy. So it's basically, here's a definition on how privacy risk should be managed. And then, like I said before, we have these frameworks. So in this example, I'm going to take this principle from the ISACA framework dealing with choice and consent. And what I've highlighted here in red is 3 points, which are, I'll discuss here on this next slide. So these 3 bullet points here on the leftmost privacy principle were the 3 that were highlighted in red right here. And if you take those, so that's a principle, so that you have ensure that consents have been obtained for these 3 situations. And then we turn it over to what our controls are, which it's not a one-to-one, but it's before we collect, we begin collecting activities, we're going to, or before we're using, we're going to tell people how it was collected and whether we transfer it. So we've got things in place here that supports the privacy rights. Our privacy notice is clear and transparent, and we get our consent from the data subject, and we have processes in place to manage that consent. So these, you can take the principles and turn it into controls, and then, so that's the control is what you will evaluate to determine if your privacy program, how mature it is. So we use that little privacy hack, I'll call it, to go from principle to a control. And then we'll actually measure the our privacy program, which we're going to use. This is one that you can find this out on the internet, and it's basically called the CMMI Matrix. And that is, I knew this back, this has been out there for quite some time, and it was developed by the Carnegie Mellon Institute in Pittsburgh. And it used to be, I always knew it as the CMMI matrix, and that stood for the Carnegie Mellon Maturity Index. And now, when you go out on the internet to find it, it's the same index, but it's now called the Capability Maturity Model Index. So I'm guessing that Carnegie Mellon probably sold the rights to it off, and then now it's not using that same Carnegie Mellon name. But it's got 6 stages of, basically, you can think of it as a 0 through 5, incomplete being 0 and optimized being 5. And also keep in mind that just like risk that we've talked about previously in webinars, risk is a quote unquote a balancing act between the risk and the reward. How much does the control cost to alleviate or mitigate the risk? And you may not want to be a 5. You probably don't want to be a 0 either, but you might want to be somewhere in the middle, because you can just get something in place that's going to protect you more, but it's not going to cost, thousands or millions of dollars to implement. So going through with our example here, we put our control in place that, we're going to basically get the permission to track that data, but we've only got a clear and transparent privacy notice. And so we're going to give ourselves a 3. So if you look at this box, it's a 3 on the scale of 0 through 5, being that the privacy notice is in place, it's clear and transparent, and it's regularly reviewed. But it's not, we're not having an archive on our website where people, we can determine what's going through. Maybe we want to get to 5, maybe we don't, but that's a way that you can gauge that the maturity of your privacy program. So it's not something that You should be able to do it on your own. If you don't want to do it on your own, I'm sure you can find some independent third party that would be willing to do that for you. But it's up to you. And if you can do it, it's just like a risk assessment. You can find a CPA firm to help you with the risk assessment, same way with measuring your maturity of your privacy program. But that's just a quick process that you can use. Like I said, you'll have the slides to this webinar, so you can go back and look at it, replay the recording if you want. If privacy is something that you're concerned about at your organization, then this is a way to help you to develop a program and self-administer it, so to speak. Let's move on to our last CPE question, which is probably the most important for if you want to get CPE, is just to tell us you want CPE, and then we'll issue you a certificate. So just answer yes or no there, and we'll wait till we get okay. That looks like we've got everybody that's been asking for CPE. So let's move on to our last agenda item, which is just wrapping up today's webinar. So that takes us to some of our questions. I think we've got a little bit of time here at the end that we can go through and do some decent questions if we've got some from the audience. Michelle, is there anything that's come in from the Q&A?
Yes, we had a couple questions that came in. As a SMB in Ohio, why should I be concerned with privacy?
Okay, that's a good question. Like I said, a lot of people, may think that they don't have to worry about it, and I'm going to translate the acronym for those that may not be aware. SMB is basically a small medium business. So the question is coming from Ohio, and so I would just say that, again, where are your customers at? If you have customers in one of those 5 states from the IAPP.org where it was talking about privacy regulations, then you would obviously have to deal with those states' regulations, because we don't have anything federal. But keep that in mind. Keep that IAPP.org website, in your list of things that you check on a regular basis, and so you want to make sure you're adhering to those regulations. Also, customer retention these days there's the old adage that it's easier to retain a customer than it is to get a new one. So a lot of times you can help that retention by being transparent with your customers as far as, what are you doing with, gathering personal information. So that's a big thing. And then just risk in general. I know when I filed for our renewal of our cybersecurity insurance this year, I was asked things about privacy, as far as like, do we have a privacy policy on our website? So you got to be concerned about your own regulations. You got to be concerned about transparency for customer retention, and you have to be concerned about risk and how you're going to mitigate that risk if you're going to use cybersecurity insurance. Those firms or underwriters are looking more and more to find out if you're taking in privacy into account for your day-to-day operations. So I think that's why, even though you're just a small or medium business in Ohio, that you need to be concerned about privacy regulations and the maturity of your program. Any other questions, Michelle?
Yes. The next one that just came in was, what steps do you recommend regarding privacy at an SMB?
Yeah, so that's another good question. And, the things to keep in mind, are, the first thing you need to know is what kind of data are you collecting? Because like I mentioned before, I've received inquiries from, they look more like they're automated or people just trying to catch us doing something or not doing something that we should be doing. And so they ask us, can you tell me what data you have captured on me, and then can you delete it? So in order to be able to do that, you're going to need to know basically what personal information are you collecting as part of your business processes. So what data you have and know where it's at. So is it on site? Is it in a cloud application? There's a lot of ramifications there, but you need to start off as your first step of having an inventory of your data. And then be aware of where your customers are located. So are any of, again, IAPP.org regulation trackers. Do you have any customers that you're doing business with that are in those states or countries in the just using an example of GDPR? And so you're going to want to follow those privacy regulations to a T, because maybe you have customers in California, but your revenue levels are less than what is required on when I talked about those 3 requirements for following GDPR. So keep that in mind. But again, the ways to start would be to inventory your data, know where your customers are, and then follow the regulations. Based on those 3 steps, if you have anything that's saying that you've got some privacy concerns, then you can start looking at some of those privacy frameworks to look at the principles, to turn those into controls, so that you can put together a privacy program. Then after you have one and put together, you can rate it as far as your maturity to figure out where you've got to improve that. But and if you need any help with that, just my contact information is still on the screen there. You can reach out to me. I can point you in the right direction, or give you an assist if that's what's required. But this is 5-10 years ago, we never even talked about privacy. Now privacy, like I said, it's turning into more and more of a big deal. And like I said, it was on our cybersecurity insurance renewal. So you definitely want to keep it in mind. I think we have a few more minutes here, Michelle. Any other questions come in?
Yes, one more just came in. Who is typically responsible for privacy within the organization?
Okay, that is kind of, that question really depends a lot upon how big your organization is. So if you are a larger organization where you have a C-suite, where you've actually got people handling IT security, and then you can put privacy under that individual, because they are closely related. So it often makes sense to do that. So if you do have a CISO or a Chief Information Security Officer, you could do that. Or it could end up being just part of if you have an IT director or a CIO, could work under that helmet, or that's not a good word, but under that person's purview. If it's a smaller organization, it may just roll up to the president or the owner, and or member of executive management. You may have a legal person on staff, or you may outsource it to your legal aspects. But keep in mind that your company is responsible for these controls, even if you outsource it. So you can't typically outsource a control. That's not going to go over well. But it could be a member of executive management if it's a smaller business. And again, you have to look at what the requirements are based on revenue levels and where your customers are located, as to if this is going to be something that you're really going to need to be concerned with. I've seen it be the responsible of like a chief operating officer but again, that's really quite dependent on the size of the organization. So, any other questions, Michelle?
Not at this time.
Okay. So again, if you have any questions after the fact, feel free. My contact information is up there. Again, we're going to send out these slides to you. So you can send me an email, you can call me at the office, and I can answer questions on privacy or anything cybersecurity regarded IT security, cybersecurity, data governance, whatever it could be. Let me know. And then I hope that you found this webinar interesting today. So again, we do this every fourth Wednesday of the month. So our next webinar is going to be March 22nd, and we're going to, I haven't come up with an official title for it, but it's going to be talking about what things you can do to secure your personal information, your identity, your individual cyber posture for individuals. As in April, we're going to follow that up with we have a guest speaker from a cybersecurity forensics organization up in the Cleveland area, where we're going to talk about what to do if there's a business type cyber attack on some of the different areas or vectors where that could come in at. So we're going to do 2 consecutive webinars. One, they're going to be kind of on the same general topic, but the details are going to be different. The first one is going to be regarding the personal aspects of protecting information or securing it. And then the April one will be talking more about business. So again, thanks for attending today. I hope you found it worthwhile, and be on the lookout for the invites for the upcoming webinars in both March and April. And again, we'll send out the recording and the slide deck. So if you have any questions after receiving those or before receiving those, reach out to me and I'd be happy to help you out. Everybody have a great day and stay safe. Thank you.